She won a 500 mailer contract, and the next day she threw him out, unaware he owned the company that awarded her the contract. But what he did next shocked her. The words didn't just headline the feeds. They stalked the halls of the courthouse like a verdict that arrived before the judge did. Cassandra Blake walked out of courtroom 4B beneath a gallery of murmuring faces, her white suit cutting through the air like an executive signature, her chin lifted in the crisp angle of someone who believed numbers could absolve intentions. Emerson Hale remained seated, hands clasped, a stillness that read as defeat to everyone who didn't know that still water stores the deepest pressure. When the gavel fell and the marriage was severed by law, Cassandra didn't wait to meet his eyes. She pivoted, heels a metronome, and told the hallway press, "I refuse to be anchored to failure." And somewhere a camera caught Emerson flinch, not at the word, but at the memory it dragged behind it. In that instant, the 500 mailer contract haunted every syllable. The 500 mailer's contract she had just won from Apex Meridian's biotech subsidiary. The 500 mailer contract that would scale her company's diagnostic pods into cities that barely had running water. The 500 mailer contract that tasted like rescue and freedom, and every light she had chased since childhood. She had pitched the 500 mailer contract in a room that smelled like linen and capital, under a chandelier that poured light the way power pours lenience. Cassandra had dazzled with risk matrices and uptime promises, and a rollout schedule that sang like a military hymn. But more than that, she wore survival with a sheen that glossed over fear. The child of a house where bills arrived like threats, the girl who wrote scholarship essays under a flickering bulb, the woman who turned insomnia into 30-page decks. The 500 mailer contract felt like the universe finally paying a debt. It was easier to toss Emerson into yesterday's drawer if failure could be framed as an obstacle instead of a person. In whispers that didn't reach microphones, she said he'd grown small, that his small business had collapsed and turned him into a shadow, that the silence between them had gotten so loud it clipped through the walls at night. She didn't mention the nights in the small kitchen when they'd laughed over burnt pancakes, or the candlelit vows they spoke when their apartment smelled like paint and promise, or the day a storm knocked out power and they ate cold noodles on the floor, dreaming aloud about how they'd make a life so full it would shove storms aside. She didn't mention them because the courtroom didn't have file space for tenderness, only for position. Emerson walked out last, the courtroom's stale air trying to cling to him as if even the building wanted a piece of the man who'd just been publicly labeled obsolete. On the steps, flashbulbs bit his face and then lost interest when he didn't give them language to feed on. He carried his silence like a sheath. Around him, Cassandra's new investors spoke among themselves in improved voices. He caught a phrase as it drifted past. Optics. Another. Velocity. Words that had once been their shared currency now sounded like eviction notices. But the part of Emerson that bled did not bleed where they could see. He bled in the workshop he rented after his storefront failed, a concrete box that slept cold at night and woke with the metallic smell of solder and resolve. He remembered how Cassandra's laugh had changed, light at first, then hollow, then pitched high in rooms with men who leaned on marble bars and told her she was remarkable, without ever asking what she had survived to become that way. He remembered carrying her to bed the night her mother died, then watching a year later as Cassandra accepted a donor's glass of champagne and smiled through the ache because grief makes bad company for ambition. He remembered fixing a neighbor's generator for free during the blackout that roasted the city. The thanks he received, a handshake, and a rumor he didn't hear until months later. Emerson used to be someone. In flashbacks that cut clean through him, he saw the day his business faltered, supply chain snarled, a client defaulted, and a landlord who'd promised patience discovered new math. He saw Cassandra watching him dismantle the sign above the door, the way her mouth shaped concern but her eyes measured risk. He heard later her voice at the sink, water on full blast to muffle it. "I can't drown with you." He didn't answer because he didn't know how to tell her he'd been learning to breathe underwater his whole life. The 500 mailer's contract's echo followed him even here, like a bell that refused to stop ringing. It shook loose a memory he wished would sleep. A night 3 years earlier, Cassandra asleep on his shoulder on their thrift store couch, when his phone lit with an email marked Dormant Asset Inquiry. He'd clicked out of boredom and found a breadcrumb trail tied to his late grandfather's union share program, shares that had rolled into a private trust, that had been rolled again into a bland shell with a fishing town name and unknowingly to him, joined a lattice of holdings inside a parent entity now called Apex Meridian. He had shrugged, filed the letter in a folder named Later, and gone back to stroking Cassandra's hair while the TV glowed with someone else's story. Later became a habit, then a fog. Years passed in inches that felt like miles. Cassandra took meetings at rooftop clubs that pretended to be private when they were only high. She collected admirers who loved to say they believed in women in tech, while cutting checks to men they'd known since prep school. She believed their attention validated the ache she never spoke of. Emerson took odd jobs and learned how to survive humiliation without letting it metastasize into bitterness. He slept on a cot in the corner of his workshop, the blanket stiff with solder dust, the pillow a spare jacket. He wrote code at night, designed power-efficient control boards by dawn, and taught himself how to read contracts like they were foreign poems he could translate if he read them slowly enough. Then, on a night when the city's tired heat finally broke into rain, his inbox pinged with a message that felt like a hand on the shoulder he had grown used to carrying alone. The sender was a trust officer with a voice that apologized even in writing. The subject line said, "Dormant beneficial interest, action required." Emerson opened it by reflex and found, nested inside, a map of what later had become. Minority shares laddered into an entity whose quiet profits had quietly compounded, tied by law to him through his grandfather's stubborn insistence that work should leave a remainder. The numbers were not obscene, not yet, but they had gravity. With care, with intelligence, with the kind of patience that can only be forged in a workshop at 3 a.m., they could become an engine. He didn't tell Cassandra. By then, their words were only weather reports. "I'm late. I'm fine. We need to talk." The inheritance arrived not as a windfall, but as a blueprint. He formed an LLC, then a holding company with a name so ordinary it was invisible, Harbor and Hearth. He bought machines from a failing competitor for pennies on the dollar, hired 2 out-of-work technicians who were better than their resumes, and started stacking small wins. He built a reputation for shipping quietly and fixing fast. He learned how to be uninteresting to people who preyed on spectacle and irresistible to those who valued delivery. The day Cassandra signed her $500 contract with Apex Meridian's subsidiary, Emerson attended a different signing in a room that had no windows, a cross-option agreement that, if triggered, would give Harbor and Hearth the controlling vote in a sleepy parent fund that just happened to hold the hinge that turned the door Cassandra had just walked through. No champagne, no press. Just a pen that didn't shake and a witness who said, "You sure about this?" And Emerson, who answered, "I've never been more." Outside the courthouse, after the divorce, after the microphones, a gust of wind tugged at Cassandra's jacket like a child who wanted attention. She smoothed the fabric, smiled for a camera that had already turned away, and told herself power was finally simple. Emerson walked into the rain and let it decide whether to baptize or drown him. Either way, he was done negotiating oxygen. He was building weather now. Before the headline, before she won a $500 contract, the next day she threw him out, unaware he owned the company that awarded her the contract, and what he did next shocked her. There were the nights Emerson Hale spent turning a dormant inheritance into a living organism. Harbor and Hearth began like a rumor in a strip of warehouses where forklifts coughed and men in neon vests spoke in weather. He wired the first machines with his own hands, the solder iron burning a crescent into his thumb that healed into a pale crescent moon. He hired Nora Kemp, who'd been laid off from a robotics firm that paid in compliments when payroll got thin, and Zeke Martell, a field engineer whose hands looked like they remembered coal even if he was born too late to mine it. He paid them a little more than he could because respect compounds too. At night, when the city dulled to a blue hush, Emerson mapped entities like constellations. Harbor and Hearth acquired a minority stake in Caravel Street Partners, which held a senior note in Meridian Key Holdings, a slow-breathing parent with as much personality as a bank vault and as much reach as a myth. Meridian Key quietly owned Apex Meridian, the biotech umbrella whose procurement arm would later publish the 500 mailers request for proposal Cassandra Blake devoured like oxygen. Emerson refused shortcuts. On the day Apex Meridian's RFP went live, he closed his laptop and stared at the workshop ceiling as if it were a sky that might answer back. He recused himself from anything that smelled like steering. He wanted the $500 contract to land where merit demanded, so when it landed with Cassandra, he could live with the arithmetic. Cassandra couldn't see any of that lattice work. Most people never do. She saw the $500 contract as a stage with her name in lights. The week after the courtroom, she moved through glass lobbies like a swan through a mirror, meeting with Bennett Cross, a venture darling with Salt Temple hair and a watch designed to be noticed, and with Dahlia Rourke, a philanthropist who wore grievances like pearls. They told Cassandra she was the future. She told herself they were proof. Nights came with rooftop toasts, city lights speckled like applause, and the soft hum of promises that grew louder the colder they got. Sometimes, very late, doubt found a key. In a flashback she tried to banish, Cassandra stood in their small kitchen years earlier, stirring tomato soup, while Emerson read a warranty clause aloud like a puzzle that could be loved into sense. The power went out, storm, switch, who knows, and they ate by dripping candlelight, taking turns describing the lives they would build. "I want to make something that can't be taken," Emerson said. "I want to be someone no storm can move." Cassandra smiled into the flicker. "I want a room," she whispered, "where my decisions change the air." They had leaned against each other like two beams making an arch. She could feel even now how simple that hunger was before attention complicated it. That memory threaded itself through the present like a thin wire. She told herself not to pull. Emerson remembered something else. A Sunday morning when Cassandra's hair smelled like sun and clean cotton, she had fallen asleep on his chest while a documentary about supply chains murmured in the background. He'd traced the slope of her cheekbone and thought, "We are building a cathedral out of breakfast and deadlines." He believed then that cathedrals outlast mistakes. He hadn't accounted for pride, the solvent that turned stone back to sand. Harbor and Hearth grew like a tree that refuses to be noticed until it casts shade. Emerson signed service contracts no one bragged about. Municipal grid updates, rural diagnostics, power conditioning, data center backup arrays that would never trend unless they failed. He built a reputation for showing up at 2:17 a.m. when someone else's promise was bleeding out, for fixing what other people preferred to replace. Procurement officers learned his name in a way that meant he wouldn't have to repeat it. Meridian Key's quarterly risk councils met in rooms with acoustics so perfect that silence felt curated. Emerson sat in the corner where shadows behaved. When Apex Meridian's subsidiary submitted the summary for the $500 diagnostics contract, criteria stacked: modularity, reliability, secure telemetry, mean time to repair. Cassandra's company Vectra Labs didn't merely shine. It held under scrutiny, the way steel rings true when struck. He saw her design choices and recognized the hand, the relentless way she overbuilt at the hinge, her insistence on redundant signals where others trusted a single clean line. Pride flickered through him before he extinguished it like a candle too near paper. He recused, formally, loudly to the minutes, quietly to his own heart. The scoring committee, 6 people who owed him nothing and might never know his name, ranked Vectra Labs first. The award was signed under a chandelier shaped like a frozen rainfall. Cassandra's smile in the photos was victory the way victory looks when it still believes it is an end. Emerson watched from a distance calibrated by decency and design. He sent no flowers. He carried no bitterness that would stain what came next. He reviewed the penalty clauses with the mild patience of a man who has slept on concrete and learned how not to twitch. He drafted a contingent performance agreement that would later become the escrow she'd agreed to, pressure wrapped as a parachute, and handed it to Meridian Key's counsel with a neutral. Make this normal. It wasn't revenge. It was architecture against failure. Bennett Cross took Cassandra to dinner in a room with a view that pretended the city existed only to be framed. He toasted the $500 contract with wine the color of forgiveness and told her she deserved a bigger life than the one she had settled for. "You outran gravity," he said, smiling the way men smile when they suspect they're the story. Cassandra felt beautiful and dangerous and a little bored, which she misfiled as confidence. In a bathroom mirror that turned faces into magazine covers, she watched her mouth say, "I'm not afraid of outgrowing." Somewhere under the contouring and the halogen, a smaller, truer voice asked, "Outgrowing what?" Flashback. The day her mother's eviction notice curled at the corners on a refrigerator that hummed like a threat. 15-year-old Cassandra stood in a hallway smelling of dust and someone else's cooking, and promised that one day landlords would treat her last name like a password. That vow calcified into something useful and then into something that bit. When Emerson's business failed, that old vow snapped awake. In the courtroom, it wore clean white. Inside, it wore a fist. On a Tuesday that had a courthouse at noon and a silence by evening, Cassandra texted Bennett a photograph of the signed $500 award letter as if it were a love note. He responded with fireworks and a black heart and a suggestion, "Let's talk prenup." She laughed, then stopped, then laughed again, because sometimes fear dresses as humor to get past the guards. She pushed the thought aside and scheduled a board meeting. She had milestones to command and a narrative to harden. Emerson stood in his workshop with a stack of purchase orders and a quiet that felt earned. Zeke asked if Emerson was going to the rooftop party Vectra Labs was rumored to be throwing. Emerson smiled like a man who had learned that some doors aren't entrances, they're exits waiting to be named. "We've got installs in Tallahassee and Tempe," he said. "Rooftops are for people who think the floor is theirs." Nora snorted and went back to calibrating a test rack. Work like mercy made good ballast. Foreshadowing arrived with the softness of a receptionist's voice. An email from Apex Meridian's compliance lead noting that a third-party logistics vendor had been flagged for invoice games. Cassandra skimmed, forwarded, and added, "Handle." Emerson read the same notice as a weather report. He drafted a framework for independent verification, not as a trap but as a net. And in a glass tower Cassandra hadn't yet noticed, one she would one day walk into with a folder, clutched like a life raft. Meridian Key's lobby polished its obsidian floor to a mirror shine. The guard practiced pronouncing names he rarely said out loud. A bouquet arrived for a board member's birthday, and perfumed the air with lilies, the kind of scent that suggests ceremony even when the day is ordinary. A door at the end of the hall bore no name. Inside, a desk held a pen that never ran out. From across the distance, Cassandra and Emerson stood on timelines that rhymed without knowing it. She floated higher on the 500 mailer contract, delighting in the narrative that she had outgrown a man who couldn't keep up. He sunk deeper into structure, learning how to move levers without leaving fingerprints. She had thrown him out. He had stepped aside. She was unaware he owned the company that awarded her the contract. He arranged his ownership so cleanly that even truth would need a badge to get near it. And what he would do next, the shape of it already sketched in escrow language and conflict of interest walls and a refusal to humiliate, would shock her, not because it was cruel, but because it was exact. The week the $500 contract moved from headlines into obligations, Cassandra Blake learned what victory feels like when it's asked to perform. Auditors arrived with tablets and politeness that felt like cross-examination. Their emails read like rain, constant cleansing cold. She stood at the center of Vectra Lab's war room, a glass cube where the city looked arranged for her, and marshaled her lieutenants with a tempo that made exhaustion look like choreography. The phrase $500 contract burned through every stand-up, every vendor call, every Gantt bar she dragged 2 pixels left. She used it like a spell, as if repeating it would pin the universe to a schedule. She used it to quiet the noise that still buzzed from the courthouse. From the day she threw him out and told the cameras failure would never darken her threshold again. Compliance flagged a logistics firm for playing with invoices. Cassandra wrote "replace" in the margin and kept moving. Security demanded immutable logs for chain of custody. She nodded, yes, as if the word itself had torque. Finance warned that the bridge loan's covenant would bite if even one milestone slid. She signed the wiring instructions with a steady hand and told herself steadiness was proof. What she didn't sign, because it didn't cross her desk that way, was the letter Meridian Key sent to Argentum Bank, drafted in a room she had never seen by a man she had vowed never to need. It offered comfort to the bank and a frame to Vectra Labs, escrow tied to uptime, penalties that felt like bracing, not punishment. It sounded like an enemy taking away excuses before the battle started. Cassandra's nights were hotel rooftops and glassware. Her days were alarms, dashboards, and the sterile music of air handlers. Bennett Cross appeared like a solution with cufflinks. He took her to a private dining room where the napkins were heavier than her first winter coat. "You're a $500 founder now," he said, as if the contract were a title deed. "Don't let small people define your horizon." He meant Emerson without saying his name. Cassandra drank water that had won an award and felt the old vow inside her sharpen. Never drown with anyone. Bennett's hand landed on hers as if it had a passport. After we close your Series C, he murmured, we'll discuss structure, prenup trusts, optics, clean as sexy. She smiled and told herself it was strategy when it felt like surrender by a prettier name. Foreshadowing disguised itself as logistics. A calendar invite labeled Board Observer Seating Meridian Key slipped onto her screen, one line among many. Kiera, her CFO, raised an eyebrow. Parent oversight, she said. They'll want to see how we breathe. Cassandra shrugged. Let them watch, because she'd learned that confidence. Like perfume travels before you do. Friday. The boardroom smelled faintly of lilies someone thought would make the room behave. The directors took their places like chess pieces lifting themselves. Cassandra opened with velocity. All 500 Mallory's contract and performance. 40 pods this tranche, 99.96 uptime, diagnostics throughput, telemetry security, patch cadence. She spoke like a metronome that refused to bend. Midway through a slide labeled penalty avoidance strategy, the door opened without drama, the way truth enters when it doesn't need to be announced. Emerson Hale stepped in wearing a suit designed to delete his edges. He stood where observers stand, just off the table's gravity. For a heartbeat, Cassandra's chest forgot its choreography. The courthouse replayed. The gavel, the word failure spoken like a mask she'd yanked off him and shoved into the press. Flashback, uninvited. The small kitchen, his palm warm on her back while soup simmered. A vow whispered into the cheap light that they would be the kind of people who made storms irrelevant. The room returned all at once, her directors' faces tilting toward the new gravitational center. Kira's quick glance that asked, do we acknowledge this history, or do we professionalize it to death? Ms. Blake, the chair said, sensing static. Our observer from Meridian Key. Emerson's voice was clear water. Thank you for having me. For the record, I'm attending in a parent oversight capacity. I've recused myself from Apex Meridian procurement decisions. I'm here to help the 500 Muller contract land where its promise lives. Delivery. Cassandra found her footing by standing perfectly still. Welcome, she said evenly. We're aligned on delivery. He clicked a remote and advanced to a slide Cass hadn't built. It was spare, relational, almost kind. Performance assurance framework, he said. 5% of each milestone payment held in escrow and released upon independent verification of uptime and throughput. In exchange, Meridian Key issues a comfort letter to your lender, reducing spread, easing the covenant. It's pressure that catches rather than crushes. His gaze didn't touch her, which was its own kind of touch. The pension fund director leaned forward. What do you lose if they miss a beat? Emerson didn't blink. Money is arithmetic. What we all lose is time, reputation, and the public's patience for promises. This structure says we respect the 500 Muller contract enough to bind ourselves to it. Cassandra hated that the math sang. Kira's fingers danced in the air as if they held an invisible calculator. Spread reduction saves 7 figures across the bridge. Escrow disciplines cash flow without choking it. She turned to Cassandra with a look that said, say yes and own it. Cassandra remembered the courtroom again, throwing him out, telling the world failure couldn't live here. We accept, she said, and then, because she refused to be framed, she added, if we exceed the target by 2 basis points on uptime, escrow ratchets down to 3% next milestone. She watched his face for triumph or resentment. Found neither, only the lightest nod, the admission that excellence should move the goalposts only forward. The meeting became a river finding its banks. They argued cryptographic attestation and MTTR, debated whether to own the fleet or white label a logistics partner. Emerson spoke only when silence asked him to. When the angel investor pushed on founder dependence, Cassandra answered with a slide about succession she had built in a moment of private honesty. We're building beyond me, she said. The 500 Muller contract isn't a mirror. It's a machine. A director from an early fund who had once told Cassandra to smile more on panels cleared his throat. Optics, he said carefully. Given. History. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everybody knew the headline. She threw him out the day after the 500 mailers win. Everybody could imagine the gossip, unaware he owned the company that awarded her the contract. Cassandra felt heat rise, the primitive urge to torch the narrative with a confession or a denial. Emerson rescued her by refusing to let the question exist. Optics are solved by outcomes, he said. Deliver. We'll publish the framework and the comfort letter. Sunlight makes rumor work over time. After, as chairs scuffed and doors softened, Cassandra closed her laptop deliberately, like buckling a final strap. She approached him not as a supplicant and not as a warrior, but as a woman who refused to be a simple past tense. "You could have handled this differently," she said. The word differently held a multiverse. Humiliate me. Shield me. Disappear. Announce yourself. Tell me before the courtroom. Never tell me at all. He studied some point over her shoulder the way he used to look at the horizon when they drove west for no reason. "I did what protects the $500 contract and the people it will touch," he said. "What I did next, this has to shock you not because it's cruel, but because it isn't." Flashback, his grandfather's workshop, a radio hissing ball games, a boy learning that you measure twice so the board forgives once. Foreshadowing, a lobby with obsidian floors, a receptionist practicing a name she doesn't yet know belongs to a ghost from the courtroom, a document waiting that will end a story and begin a lesson. Cassandra nodded, swallowed, straightened. "Then watch us exceed the target," she said, and left before the tremor in her hands forgot who owned them. Emerson remained a moment longer, listening to the room's aftersound, the way duty leaves a pressure drop. He had not come to crush. He had come to calibrate. Still, as the door closed, a thought moved through him like a shadow. Catastrophe often looks like one missed Tuesday. He hoped she had fewer of those than he did. The rooftop dinners thinned. Bennett Cross's text cadence grew erratic, laden with excuses that smelled like perfume sprayed on smoke. A whisper traveled up the elevator shafts of glass buildings. Bennett's flagship fund had a hole. Risk was rebranded as temporal dislocation. LPs called it something ruder. One evening in a private dining room where the napkins had opinions, Bennett slid a document across to Cassandra with the ease of a man who has slid many across to many. "Standard protective," he said lightly. It was a personal guarantee disguised as key person commitment stapled to a cross default clause that tied her founder shares to a short-term bridge he'd arranged at a rate that looked like a smile and bit like a trap. She felt the old vow inside her tense. Don't drown with anyone, but pride dressed the fear in strategy. She signed. She told herself she was protecting momentum. Flashback. After the courthouse, she had stood in her bathroom and looked for the woman who once ate noodles by candlelight and whispered big futures. The mirror gave her sleek hair and a sharper jawline and eyes that had learned to scan rooms for exits. Outgrowing, she had told Bennett, and the word had tasted like aspirin. Necessary, bitter, easy to overtake. In the weeks after his standard protective, she noticed friends switching tables when she walked into a room. Talia Rourke's pearls looked heavier, accusations lining up behind the kindness. The $500 contract still headlined decks, but social gravity had tilted. She found herself answering questions about sustainability when what the askers meant was, will the tide keep covering the rocks? She doubled down on work. A stormy Thursday delivered a small catastrophe wrapped in polite language. A supplier overseas misfiled a customs form. 3 pods sat in a bonded warehouse while the clock spent money. Vectra Labs pivoted, reallocated, remapped routes like an air traffic controller juggling metal and hope. Uptime held by a thread and then snapped an instant before midnight. 95% for one day. Another penalty. Argentum raised an eyebrow in email. Cassandra asked for a temporary covenant waiver, just a week, to smooth an aberration. Argentum replied they'd need consent from parent oversight per the comfort letter terms. Meridian Key held the pen. The lobby she had never set foot in before smelled faintly of lilies and money that had learned not to speak. Obsidian floors reflected faces back in softer focus. The guard's voice practiced her name as she approached. "Ms. Blake, they're expecting you." She clutched a leather folder the way swimmers gripped the edge before the next lap. She told herself this was simple, a reasonable request and a reasonable answer. She told herself she would walk out with the waiver, the $500 contract intact, the narrative preserved. She didn't tell herself the truth, that she was walking into a room built to practice consequences. The conference door opened without drama. Emerson Hale stood at the far end, a set of windows behind him bisecting a gray sky. He had the calm of a man who had learned to metabolize storms. He didn't move to greet her. He didn't need to. The pen on the desk waited like a witness that never tires. She stopped 3 paces from the table, air thinning on principle. "I need a covenant waiver," she said, launching before pride could take the wheel. "Temporary. Logistics glitch. Verifiable. We'll clear the metrics next week." "The $500 contract stays on course," he gestured to a chair. She remained standing. He remained kind. "Sit," he said, "so you don't confuse urgency with collapse." She sat, stiff-backed, folder unopened like a promise. "I know the optics," she said, the word she used when she meant danger. "Please don't make me beg in front of the people who want me to drown." Emerson folded his hands, palms unweaponized. "I'm not here to make you beg," he said. "I'm here to protect a machine larger than either of us." He slid a document toward her with the measured gravity of someone placing a stone on a grave. "Consent to step-in rights and assignment of proceeds," the header read. The language was elegant as a guillotine. If Meridian Key consented not to a waiver but to a step-in, it would trigger terms buried in Bennett's standard protective: cross-default collateral call, transfer of Cassandra's pledged founder shares to a neutral trust pending reconstitution of leadership. Vectra Labs would continue. The 500-meter contract would be honored. The team would be paid. The machine would run. Cassandra Blake, founder, would be removed from executive control. The door she had kicked open closing on her hands without breaking her fingers. Mercy by design, doom by enforcement. Her first reaction wasn't rage. It was disorientation, like stepping off a treadmill and finding the floor untrustworthy. "You wrote this," she whispered, understanding not just the words but the stance behind them. The refusal to destroy what fed the world, paired with the refusal to excuse the person who had tried to feed the world with fumes. "You always measure twice." Flashback slammed into the present. Emerson at their thrift store table, drawing a straight line twice before cutting, because wood remembers and pride won't sand clean. Foreshadowing fulfilled, the nameless door, the pen that never ran out, the lilies perfuming procedure like a chapel. "Don't do this," she said. And now the plea rose, not elegant, human. "I was wrong about you, about us. I said things in that courtroom." Her mouth stuttered around the word failure as if it had been coated in salt. "I need you to give me a chance to prove the 500 Mellors contract isn't bigger than me because I'm small. It's bigger than me because I built it to be." He listened, and the listening hurt more than scorn would have. "I am giving you a chance," he said. "I'm keeping your work alive. I'm protecting your people and the patients they'll never meet. I'm refusing to let a covenant waiver teach them that excellence negotiates with excuses." Her eye makeup held. Her voice didn't. "Is there any—" She couldn't find the word that would fold time, reverse the gavel, unsay the interview on the courthouse steps, lift the heel that had crushed a man into an anecdote. "Is there any forgiveness that looks different than—" This, he took the pen. "Forgiveness," he said gently, "isn't the same as forgetting. I forgave you when I built structures that wouldn't require you to be perfect. I forgave you when I refused to humiliate you in that boardroom. I forgive you now by choosing stewardship over spectacle." He signed. The nib moved like a blade that knew where to land. A notary whose face could belong to anyone stamped the page. The seal clicked, small and irreversible. She folded forward, elbows on the table, hands to her face like a woman who had just learned a language too late. "Bennett said he'd—" She stopped, the sentence already obsolete. Bennett's fund had temporally dislocated itself into a crater. His promises dissolved on contact with air. Emerson stood. The air changed the way rooms do when a decision finishes being a possibility and becomes a fact. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man whose boots remembered wet concrete. "Your shares transfer to the trust today," he said. "Your salary continues through quarter end. HR will propose an advisory role if you want one later. He didn't say after the grief. Vectra Labs will deliver. Patients will get results faster than fear. That's the story you asked the world to believe. That's the story it gets." She reached across the table without meaning to, fingers closing on air where his hand had been. "Emerson," she said. And in the name there were 100 kitchens, 1,000 small mercies, a cathedral made of breakfasts and deadlines. "I'm sorry." The words weren't a key. They were a map of where she'd refused to go. "Not because you won. Because I threw away the person who would have taught me how to win without becoming this." He paused at the door. The lilies pressed their clean insistence into the moment. "You didn't throw me away," he said, not turning. You threw away the version of me you thought you needed to be seen beside. The rest of me this kept building. He opened the door. His footsteps were soft on the obsidian, a sound like the afterswell of a tide that has made up its mind. Behind him, Cassandra broke in a way the lobby had never witnessed, silently and completely, a sob that barely lifted her shoulders, the kind reserved for nights when a house knows your name. It wasn't love. Not anymore. It was the precise weight of consequences settling exactly where they belonged. The receptionist pretended to look at a screen. The guard looked anywhere else. Somewhere in the building, a printer exhaled a contract. Somewhere else, a server hummed, patient and immortal. Emerson stepped into the elevator, pressed L, and watched the doors draw themselves together. He felt no hatred. He felt a sadness that had learned discipline. He pictured 40 pods humming in a field where previously there had been waiting rooms that smelled like apology. He pictured a boy in a workshop learning to measure twice. He pictured a woman in a white suit who would someday tell a different story about what power is for. The doors opened to the street. Rain had just ended. The pavement held a mirror of the sky and then let it go. He walked, and the echo of his steps dissolved into the ordinary music of a city that had learned to devour and then digest spectacle. Behind him, in an office that kept time with contracts, a notary slid the signed document into a folder. Ahead of him, in a future that would not ask for permission, a life waited that didn't need to be narrated to matter.